Welcome back to the final episode of season one of the Blazing a Trail podcast. The last couple of episodes have focused mainly on businesses who are implementing Salesforce and are at varying stages of their Salesforce journey. We've discussed how they've gone about their implementations, challenges they face, and potential recommendations for other businesses implementing Salesforce and going through technology change. The last episode and this episode is a little bit of a twist on this, and myself and Faron are going to be discussing the role of consulting partners when implementing Salesforce and how to effectively leverage that external support. So without further ado, I'm delighted to be welcomed by Faron Young, who's a senior consultant at Cloobees. Thanks so much for joining, Faron. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the role you play at Cloobees, a little bit about your background prior to that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first off, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be able to have this chat. So my background is potentially a little bit unique in the Salesforce kind of ecosystem. I think a lot of people will say that, but I started off my career as a mechanical engineer designing engines, and found my way into kind of technology strategy consulting as a broad thing, mainly in the automotive industry and energy and utilities industry. And that's where I kind of discovered an interest in data and AI and that end of things. And so I moved, I think 2020, moved into CRM in general, like a technology agnostic consultancy, and then joined Cloobees, which is where I am now, in August of last year, where I focused on Salesforce, obviously.
Cool, good stuff. And sort of in terms of Cloobees, for those that don't know, because I know they're quite specific in terms of what they focus on within Salesforce. What's sort of their, I guess, product area focus and sort of sector focus as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I think when I first joined, it was mainly comms cloud and energy and utilities cloud. So their niche is really Salesforce Industries. This year, we've also kind of expanded a little bit into the insurance end of things, and I know that that's something we're trying to grow as well. And yeah, I think quite a new company as well. I think I joined last year. I think they started up in 2020, and honestly, since I joined them, they've been growing at quite a considerable rate. I'm really happy that I've landed where I have, because they've won some awards. I think they got Summit Partner last year, so it's going well.
Great stuff, and good to hear. And I think sort of from my experience, sort of that there is a lot of partners out there, and it sort of fluctuates and changes, and there's a number of acquisitions and that kind of stuff. But from what I see from my side, there's so many, I guess, projects out there where that have had partner involvement, and it is such a massive area of the ecosystem, and that's sort of part of the reason sort of behind the purpose of this sort of podcast. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of businesses potentially at different stages of their Salesforce implementation and journey, and they may already be leveraging a partner, or that they could sort of potentially be thinking about sort of using one. Do you feel like sort of every Salesforce implementation or technology implementation more broadly should sort of involve some kind of external specialist support?
Obviously, I'm slightly biased working for an implementation partner. I think in the vast majority of cases, absolutely. But again, it's it depends. It's kind of a sliding scale, right? You've got how much of the Salesforce offering you're hoping to implement, because Salesforce has a whole range of products now, and it keeps growing. So are you just looking at implementing, base Sales Cloud, and that's kind of it? In which case, I would still recommend having someone help you out setting it up, because there are best practices involved. And we see quite frequently that, maybe someone has tried to set it up themselves and they get by for a period of time, but then they run into scalability issues, for example, where potentially they haven't implemented it quite as intended. And then that's when we have to get involved anyway, right, at a later date. So yeah, I would say mostly, and it depends on the scope and complexity and scale of what your business is trying to achieve, really.
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched upon one thing there in terms of potential sort of scalability and best practices as well. What sort of other additional value can consultancies or partners provide that businesses that don't necessarily have themselves?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, if you're hiring a consultancy, what you're getting, even if it's, um, just consulting in general, you're getting access to such a vast amount of prior experience that you can kind of tap into. And the lessons learned from, collectively from all those people pulled together at the consultancy that you're employing, it can save you down the road, significant effort. And obviously, when it comes to Salesforce as well, take Cloobees, for example, who are Salesforce Industries experts, which means we have people who have worked in comms for decades. We have people who've worked in insurance and energy and utilities for decades. So you gain access to people who understand how Salesforce should be implemented, but you also have the ability to, if you choose the right consultancy, tap into people who've been in your industry for a very long time. And that can be invaluable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've touched upon something there, and obviously sort of the individuals within businesses who are potentially heading up these, say, Salesforce implementations or more broadly sort of technology transformation programs of work won't necessarily have had sort of maybe prior Salesforce knowledge, and they will be a little bit naive from a technology perspective when it comes to that. Obviously, you touched upon earlier that you've sort of sat across a number of different sort of technology areas and sort of technology implementations. Is there sort of anything specific to, say, Salesforce that might differ from a different sort of software or product implementation at all?
I'd say so. Part of the reason why I chose to kind of follow a career path in Salesforce is Salesforce itself is such a big company and has been around for a very long time that the guidance and support you get as a consulting partner, as a business from Salesforce themselves is excellent. Like I had not experienced that prior, working in the automotive industry as a consultant, that doesn't exist. So yeah, I would say that just the sheer amount of infrastructure and support that exists in the Salesforce ecosystem is probably unparalleled in many other places,
Yeah, cool. Useful to know for sure. Obviously, sort of potentially people tuning in might be at varying stages of their implementation, and they might not even have sort of purchased Salesforce yet, or they might be thinking about sort of re-implementation or just general sort of product enhancements or additional phases and that kind of stuff. But what would you sort of say is the right time to, depending on obviously all of those things, but generally sort of what sort of is the right time for you to sort of engage a consulting partner, do you think, in your opinion?
I think probably rule of thumb would probably be as early as possible, but there's some caveats to that, right? So I've had experience where a company has come to us as a Salesforce implementation partner, and perhaps they haven't got in place what the business itself wants to achieve. So before you engage a consultancy who might just be an implementation partner, we're talking about here, right? You have bigger consultancies who can help you with your strategy and stuff before all of that. But if you're talking to an implementation partner, a really good thing to have in place is, what is your business trying to achieve fundamentally? What are the goals for the next year, the next 5 years, and have those prioritized? And the reason I say this is because as you go through the implementation with the consultancy, there's going to be difficult decisions that need to be made. When we have this concept of the MVP, the minimum viable product that we implement with customers, and what gets included in that should be informed by what ultimately is your business trying to achieve. So what can we implement for you as soon as possible that lets you achieve the goals you're trying to achieve? So it helps you prioritize the work that needs to be done early on. And obviously, you can refine things as you go, but that would be the one thing I would say is really useful when customers come to us and they have clearly prioritized values for what they want to achieve.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And that's something that I think has been a common theme through, obviously, both through what you've raised here and in sort of previous customer success stories, businesses that have been sort of the most successful within broader technology change have a real clear picture and idea of what they sort of want to achieve and want to implement, and that is super, super important when going through any kind of technology change program of work, for sure. Obviously, we touched upon earlier that there's loads of different vendors and partners out there in the space. Obviously, plug Cloobees if you want, but how as sort of from a business perspective, how do you go about choosing the right partner for you?
Again, a very consultancy based answer is it depends. It depends what industry you're in. I think one of the things we're seeing, and we might touch on this later, is that there's more and more kind of niche consultancies popping up because Salesforce is bringing on all these new products and expanding all the different areas that it's looking at that, depending on what business you're in, i.e. line of industry, or how big you are, that will inform what kind of consultancy you want to work with, right? If you're a small business and you just want to set up, base Sales Cloud, you can probably afford to go with a smaller consultancy with less resource available because that's potentially simpler to set up. If, however, you have, big plans, you want everything to be scalable, perhaps you have the need for a complex multi-cloud solution, that's when you probably want to start looking at someone who's got, good experience and also experience in the industry that you're working in and the clouds you want to look at. And one thing I would also say is if you're speaking to multiple consultancies, what tends to be a really good green flag is if they are not just telling you, here's all the things we can give you. Yes, we can achieve everything. Look out for the consultancies that are going to say things like, here's the boundaries within which we can work. Here's potentially what you can't do, telling you, being pragmatic and saying what's achievable realistically. I think that's a good green flag to look out for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this might not be an overly relevant question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Because I guess the majority of businesses that say you're implementing to from a sector perspective, you guys focus sort of obviously very heavily on Salesforce Industries. So, and obviously that's defined to a couple of 2 or 3 sectors, majoritively at the minute. So obviously for you guys, you're going to have both the product knowledge and the sector knowledge for most of the businesses that you implement to. But is there one of those that say maybe more important than the others? Say if a business is, I don't know, obviously every consultancy is going to have done a Sales Cloud implementation before, but say, is it more important that they've done a Sales Cloud implementation before within that specific sector, or the fact that they've got the sector experience rather than maybe the product knowledge that's more important, or not really, neither, both of them are equally as important?
That is a really good question. I would say that industry experience is probably higher value, slightly higher value. And the reason I say this is because Salesforce is such a good product that it's it's the best in the industry, and it's very well thought out. So you're going to find a lot of people who can set it up well. The real value then, I guess, comes if you have people who have done that, but also have experience with other businesses in your industry where there might be some little lessons learned that are unique to that industry that you really wouldn't know if you'd not worked in that industry before. Small tricks of how to make things more efficient or compliant or anything like that. So yeah, I'd say slightly more valuable to have industry experience.
Cool, and good answer, because I that wasn't our preset list of questions. So well done to Faron there for thinking on the spot and giving us a good answer. You mentioned obviously to begin with that you've been in sort of consulting quite a while now in obviously various different areas. What sort of common issues that you've sort of seen between customers and consulting partners?
Yeah, so it's all around communication, really. And there's some things that kind of branch off of that, right? So first off, one of the key things you have to do is make sure everybody is aligned at the beginning of a project. That means knowing what are the key objectives of the business. Do we have a plan of action if things go wrong? If you don't have that in place, when inevitably on a project things go slightly awry from your perfectly laid out plan, it's good to have a process in place that you've agreed upon that can be followed. If you don't have that in place, it can lead to some friction. Then I'd say assumptions are dangerous. So never be, when you're engaging with a consulting company of any kind, never really make assumptions. And that works as working as the consultant, but also working as the client, right? If there's something you're not necessarily sure about, don't assume, go and ask the question, because sometimes no one's thought about the answer to it. And that philosophy has saved me a few times on projects where there's things that people don't think about. We're all human, really. We're going to forget stuff. So yeah, being open with communication and being honest and pragmatic, that's the way forward. If you're trying to avoid certain conversations, I think that can lead to some friction down the road potentially.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a little bit of synergy in there when sort of, not obviously within the selection of a consulting partner, but sort of recruitment of bodies as well. I've found it super challenging when there's been multiple people involved in a program of work, of which there will be in pretty much every one of these programs. But they haven't really had that communication, and they're completely misaligned on what they want from a hire. And it may well be the same when engaging a consulting partner. Kind of like one person might have an idea as to what they want out of the partner, but somebody else might have a completely different idea of what they want from the partner. And that kind of misalignment, both of partners and recruitment and various other things, is a massive sort of red flag when I sort of see that, and makes my job an absolute nightmare. So I imagine it does for you guys as well.
Yeah, it's kind of in human nature to maybe hide some things away, but as much as possible, being upfront about things is just going to save you stress down the line, for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that kind of leads us on nicely to my next question around sort of those stakeholders and senior level buy-in. Again, sort of, if you've listened to other episodes, you'll have seen how crucial that's been, again, to successful implementation. Sort of from a consulting perspective, how do you sort of go about sort of gaining that sort of trust from stakeholders and sort of generating sort of buy-in from those key stakeholders? Yeah,
so it changes depending on who you're working with. There are some trends that you tend to see. If you go by kind of stakeholder level, we call it seniority within the business that you're working with. if you're working with people who are going to be working with Salesforce, for instance, day to day, building a really good rapport with them helps them to feel comfortable telling you what their real quibbles are with the way they currently work, and you then being able to solve some of those small issues for them, that really gets them on board. With senior stakeholders, it can be maybe they're like a values driven person. So is our implementation abiding by the values that we have in place as a business, or the goals that we have in place as a business? Or they could be really data oriented, in which case you know being as quantifiable as possible with what work you're doing for them can really be beneficial. So maybe they want to see, you know, what's the pound value of the benefits that I'm seeing by implementing Salesforce, and there's some things you can do around that on like time saved and stuff. So it depends on who the stakeholders are, but there's a variety of ways.
Yeah. I know you can't go into specifics from a customer perspective, but is there any sort of examples where you've had maybe in the first few weeks or months of engaging with a business where sort of they've been a little bit hesitant or reticent to sort of use your services, where you feel like they've not really been on board, but then there's kind of been that flicking of the switch where that's sort of changed? And if so, sort of what I guess caused that sort of change in their attitude to you guys?
Yeah, there is one example that I have in mind because it worked so well, where this was at another company. I was working in the early stages, effectively like a kickoff of an implementation, and we were kind of receiving a little bit of I wouldn't say pushback, but there's some questions were being asked from very senior stakeholders as to, is this implementation really something we want to do? Because it was going to be a very large implementation. There was, you know, years of work. And so what we decided to do was we were thinking, okay, well, we're just going to try and estimate just how much value you're going to receive from implementing Salesforce. And the way we did that was we came up with a way of basically putting a pound value of how much money would be saved by implementing Salesforce for this business, which was done via employee interviews and gauging how much time was being lost on various activities and things like that. And when we went back to the client with this presentation we had, I think we spent probably a week putting it together. Immediately, the benefit was visible to them, and the buy-in was there right away. So it can be worth putting a little bit of effort into it like that, because once you have that buy-in, like we talked about earlier, the whole engagement is nicer for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And that sounds like a little bit similar to Alistair in episode 4 spoke about. Obviously, he's on the other side of the fence and heading up Salesforce internally, but where there was some hesitation internally, they sort of did a pilot project to a very sort of small entity or number of users and demonstrated the value that had just for that very small business unit, and then sort of talked about basically doing the same across the rest of the business. So whether it be through a live example where you could demonstrate that value, or through sort of the research that you did, kind of predicting the value that you guys would add and the time you could save, or the money that you could save or bring in some instances, that they're kind of definitely key recipes for sort of success in these instances. Obviously you semi-alluded to it there, but any sort of, I guess, and there's a few things that you've touched upon in terms of sort of do's and don'ts, but any sort of customers that have been sort of really sort of challenging, and where sort of the relationship hasn't sort of worked at all, and reasons behind that?
I think fortunately for me, it's very rare in my somewhat limited experience, right? But I think that there's been some customers where like I mentioned before, if the business internally is not aligned before the engagement starts, for whatever reason that may be, then when the engagement begins and you start as a BA or a consultant, you start talking to the different teams. Each of those teams will be giving you requirements for what they want, and if the end goal that they are aligned to, they don't have that in common, then the requirements are going to clash, and you're going to get conflicting things back from the client that they want to implement, and that can lead to some significant friction and engagement with a customer, but ultimately can be resolved if you go back to the fundamentals of take it back to why ultimately are you doing this, and you take the various stakeholders through that, you can alleviate a bit of that friction. But that tends to be where problems on a project will come from, is just uncertainty and misalignment, which I know is a very generic and general answer, but in my experience, that is absolutely the case.
Yeah, for sure. Touched upon obviously earlier on in this episode around sort of when sort of businesses should engage consultancies, and that pretty much for every program of work that there should be some kind of external support. But how do you go about sort of balancing that potentially with internal resources, and what would sort of be your advice in terms of should all the knowledge be external? Should it be majoritively internal? Should it be a balance of both in your experience?
It certainly should be a balance of both. But that scale can tip in either direction depending on a variety of things, such as the size of the project, the complexity of the engagement, the size of the business, how complex is the business. There's some rules of thumb that I would kind of, I would say need to be on every project, which is having a central kind of channel of communication, such as a product manager and a PM. Maybe those two would be like a minimal requirement, I would say, because it makes just the communication significantly more efficient on an engagement with a client.
Cool. Obviously, whilst you mentioned that you're relatively green in consulting, you've obviously sort of got quite a bit of experience still, and I imagine sort of when you first sort of started out in tech consulting is probably very different to sort of your experience of what you look like now. Any advice that you'd give to a younger you / sort of individuals sort of starting their journey in consulting?
Yeah, it's similar advice that I would give to, newer BAs or consultants that start, is don't panic when things go wrong. Because on every project, like, I'm trying to think if I've ever had a project that has gone swimmingly with no issues, and I don't think that exists. Unexpected things are going to go wrong, and when it happens, you just have to kind of learn to soak it up. And there's always a solution to the issue that you're facing. So just accepting that there's uncertainty, I think, is one of the key things that I've learned over the years, is how to deal with uncertainty and how to deal when things don't go to plan. That's probably the key piece of advice I would give. Yeah,
wise words for sure. And I appreciate that you've not been in sort of the Salesforce consulting world necessarily for a massive amount of time compared to some individuals necessarily, but more broadly in consulting, do you think things have changed in terms of what's expected from a consulting partner and their role to businesses over the last few years? Did you see it sort of changing in the future?
There's certainly some of the methodologies that are used within consultancies have changed significantly when I first started. And this could be because it was less software, more kind of design oriented things. But When I first started, it was waterfall project management. Now basically everything is agile, and there's more specialism in certain areas because technology is developing so fast. Take Salesforce, for example, where this year at Dreamforce was basically an AI convention, right? I wouldn't be surprised if there's AI specific consultancies popping up all over the place or very soon. I know that we as Cloobees have to start looking into these things because it's developing so quickly. And on that front as well, we're starting to look at internal tools using things like AI. So that's going to be a whole game changer, I think, in terms of efficiency and getting work done probably quicker than previously possible.
Yeah, and I know it's sort of an area that you're super interested in, and we could go on for down a wormhole down sort of the AI route. But have you got sort of any predictions or thoughts on how that's sort of going to radically change the Salesforce ecosystem, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at Dreamforce this year, the one thing that I think people are slowly realizing potentially is that AI right now is really powerful, and you have to think that this is the worst it's going to be. So it's only going to keep getting more powerful. So the things you're seeing now are going to, 5 years from now are going to be, that's fundamental how most businesses work, right? Things around, the ability to have data clouds to integrate whatever data you want in real time into your CRM system. Possibilities there are basically endless. The ability to have AI for customer service, looking at all the data that is live streamed into your Salesforce instance, that alone is wild to think about. So yeah, I think just like most people, I would say that it's very difficult to predict where we're going to be, 2 years from now, even. But I'm certainly very excited about it, and I've been nerding out a bit about it in the backgrounds behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, for sure. And if you were able to predict what it would look like in a couple of years' time, you'd be a very rich man. That's for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just jumping back, sort of finally into sort of wrapping up this sort of consulting piece and episode. You've given some great tips and advice, both for businesses sort of thinking of sort of at various stages of their journey and sort of various stages of their journey, potentially with consulting partners, and also to individuals within consulting themselves. But anything that we haven't touched upon, and any sort of other key advice or nuggets that you'd give to businesses potentially thinking about tech transformation or going through challenges with their sort of Salesforce implementations at the minute?
Yeah, something that I would probably, even through other technology consulting prior to Salesforce, with Salesforce, is you'll tend to see businesses underestimate the complexity of a tech transformation. That would be my piece of advice, would be to accept that it's going to be potentially a long piece of work. It's probably going to be more complex than you think it is. That's why you have the ability to talk to consultancies. But ultimately it's worth it if you do it properly. The benefits on any project I've been on, the benefits that are seen it's a surprise to clients, just the benefits they get from setting up Salesforce properly.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, thanks again for joining us, Faron. Really appreciate your
Sure.
time and the wisdom you've shared on this episode. Hopefully it's useful to those tuning in, and thanks to everyone that has listened in some form over the course of this year to the episode.